Hello, I'm Bill Leopold, and welcome to this edition of Breakfast at the Barracks. Joining me today is Mukund Karwe, Professor of Food Science in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences at Rutgers New Brunswick. Mukund, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill.
Why don't you give us a working definition of what food science is and what food science does?
Right. I mean, food science is basically a combination of biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, all put together to work with food ingredients as a substrate to come up with the products that you and I eat every day, to bring it to the customer, consumer in a very convenient, wholesome, attractive, nutritious way so that you can consume them and enjoy them.
So what you talked about were kind of interdisciplinary science perspectives in terms of approaching the whole area.
It is an interdisciplinary. It's just like your food that has starch and fat and salt and proteins. Food science has chemistry, biology, engineering. It also has something that people don't think of. That's the psychology part of it. We call it sensory science. Is why do you eat certain food and why do you say I like it?
So
that's the psychophysics part of it, if you want to call it.
So psychophysics part, so you tie some of that part in with the regular science of biology. So when you're doing these kind of things, does the discipline itself have different instructors who kind of do the biology part, the psychoscience part, or do the instructors and faculty itself kind of have all those kind of components together?
No, really, we have people who specialize in different areas. For example, I'm an engineer by training. So my focus is taking raw materials and converting them using the machines into the products that like pasta and cereals and cookies and chips and stuff like that. There are people who look at the biologies. That means safety of food. Are we delivering safe food? So they focus on the microbiology of food. The other people who are sensory scientists who really are trained as a part nutritionists, part statisticians, part psychologists, so they understand the human mind and the biology of when you taste something, what happens inside your brain, stuff like that. So everybody's trained in their specialty areas, and we all work together to solve a food science problem, so to speak.
So I'm going to take a leap here. It sounds to me as that not just a classroom perspective, but it's a classroom and lab perspective so that students and faculty can really go through the whole breadth of the discipline.
That's correct. I mean, we like to call it from farm to fork. It's commonly used definition that what grows on the farm, how do you bring it to your table in a very wholesome, attractive, nutritious form? And that's where the food scientist comes into the play. Once it goes in your body, then the nutritionist takes over, so to speak.
All right, so it's really about the development before it's ingested then.
That's correct. Although we have to keep in mind that we deliver nutritious product, but primary role is between farm and fork.
So let's talk about this. A student who is interested in food science, first of all, how do they become interested and kind of what's their curriculum as they go through the food science program?
Yeah, I mean, it's an applied science. One should keep that in mind, that food science is an applied science. It's not like a pure chemistry or pure biology major. They have to be interested in the science aspects. They have to like biology. They have to like organic chemistry. They have to like general chemistry. They have to like a little bit of math, not too much. You need some math, but not too much. But they need to bring all, so that's what typically our curriculum is. First 2 years are really spent in getting the right background in terms of chemistry, biology, statistics, math. And then the later 2 years are used, or the curriculum has courses where all those disciplines are applied to specific courses such as food chemistry, food microbiology, food sensory science, food product development, food processing, and so on. So they need to be interested in science. If you don't like science, food science is not a major for you because it's not what should I say? It's not a qualitative science. It is quantitative science. And it is science-based. It's not descriptive. It is quantitative.
Let's talk a little bit more about the interests that you have and kind of what you're trying to bring to Rutgers. Culinology, am I saying that correct?
Culinology.
Culinology. Can you explain a bit about what culinology is and your interest in bringing it to Rutgers?
Sure. Yeah, culinology is a relatively new term, maybe 10, 15 years old now. It's hybrid of culinary arts, which focuses on preparation and the method that is used to make a food product, typically single serving or few multiple servings that you get in a restaurant. not 10,000 of those or 20,000 of those, not packaged, they're served on a plate. That's culinary arts.
All right.
Whereas food science is the other end of the spectrum, where you take things that are grown on the farm in terms of ingredients and grains and deliver them into multiple millions of products per day. So culinology is a hybrid of these two fields. It's a science and art of food preparation.
Well, when we bring a discipline or we bring a study like that to Rutgers, how does that add to the overall discipline in terms of what the food science department and the food science area is already offering?
I think, first of all, there is a demand for these. The reason we started this because we heard from our stakeholders, which is the people who hire our students, such as big companies like Unilever and Kellogg's and Kraft's and Campbell Soup, that we need students who are trained on both sides of the aisle. Generally, culinary arts people don't know the food science part of it. They know how, they don't know why. And the food scientists are not necessarily good chefs.
Okay.
So when a new product is developed, they really don't have the perspective of the product development that a chef has. So that's why these companies that want to come out with the products that are now more home meal replacement type of products, they want involvement of the consumer. They're not TV dinners that you just put in the microwave and serve, but they're more involved, but not too involved. So they really felt the need for students who have the background both in the science aspects and the arts aspects. And they started, why don't you come up with this kind of new major? So we said, why don't we do it together?
So let me ask this question, because when you say that, I think of the traditional TV dinner, which you said it's not, and I'm thinking more of a Marie's calendar, more of the Biggest Loser entrees that come that are nicely packaged, that look nice, but also taste nice and have some science behind it in terms of some nutrition and some other areas.
Exactly.
Is that kind of what we're talking about in that area?
Exactly right.
So it just gives that helps me to put a picture to it.
That's right. And it's a new field. The term was developed by Research Chef Association, RCA as it is called. They own the term. I mean, it's a trademark term.
All right.
And they still own the term. So whenever we use that term, we have to put that R with a circle around it to give them the credit. But we wanted to do it because I thought that's the right direction to go for our program. And that's one of the directions. I mean, we have other directions we go into.
Well, why don't you talk a little bit about those directions? So now that we understand kind of what Culinology is going through, what other directions are you heading to?
The other direction that our students focus is purely research aspects. We call food science research, which is heavily oriented into the science aspects of food. These are the people who want to go into graduate school, do masters and Ph.D. and do research in food companies, such as nanotech. How is nanotechnology going to be applicable in food products? What applications are there, and how can we safely apply nanotechnology in food science? So those are the...
And when you say nanotechnology, I'm not really sure. I mean, I have from sci-fi movies or sci-fi, I have a perspective in my head. So can you kind of really expand on kind of what nanotechnology and...
Well, by definition, a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. So it's really very, very tiny, much smaller than a human hair.
Right.
It's very, and typically the range of the length that you're talking about is 1 to 100 nanometers.
Wow.
And this is, as you know, you heard the term before. We are trying to use this to develop new flavors, new methods of encapsulating or keeping the flavors safe and protected, because during processing they get lost or they degrade. So how we can protect them by using nanotechnology. We develop new materials that are used to take out good things from the food. There's a new membrane, so to speak. We can use them to take out materials that are good in food. The old technologies of filters are not adequate sometimes, so we want to use these new materials. So there are lots of applications of nanotechnologies. Sensors, we want to know when you ate certain food, where did it go in your body? You really want to know? So we can use the nanotechnology to find it out.
Okay.
Stuff like that.
So part of the is it's not the culinary part, but it's also the research part. And
Absolutely.
as you said, it's for folks who really want to get a master's or a PhD and then work for larger areas in terms of what's going on. I want to get to some of the other things that you're really well known for and some of the things that you're doing. One of the things that you're doing a great deal of is working with the county colleges around the state of New Jersey. Explain the importance of doing that, and especially collaborating with Rutgers as, a goal of yours or as a vision in terms of what you're doing.
Right. So we started collaborating with county colleges, partly for two reasons. One is we wanted to get more students into Rutgers to do food science. But on the other hand, as you probably know, that in spite of Rutgers being a state school, affordable tuition, it's still not affordable to many families.
Correct.
So by developing the first 2 years program in the county colleges, the students can take all their preliminary courses in the county colleges and then transfer into Rutgers at the end of 2 years. So they pay tuition for the first 2 years, that is county college tuition, which is much lower.
Correct.
And if they're good, then they come to Rutgers and they ultimately get a Rutgers degree. So it's a 2+2 situation. First 2 years in county college, lower tuition. Second 2 years at Rutgers, you get a degree from Rutgers. And in the process, the parents save some money, the students save some money, and we also get good students because we only allow students with GPA of 3.0 or higher to transfer to Rutgers. So it works both ways.
So it really is kind of just creating that pathway for them.
Pathway for them.
And
exactly.
looking at them and working with community colleges to set up the prerequisites for the classes they take here. So you're really setting up a pathway to be able to say to a student, listen, there's the affordable way, and then if you do well, then you can come to Rutgers and be able to do your last 2 years here and really concentrate on a major perspective in terms of where you want to go.
Except for culinology. Rutgers, we don't have a culinology lab to teach the baking and all other courses that need to be taught for a chef to learn things. So there we have a special arrangement with Mercer County Community College, which is in the Mercer County. So they have the full-fledged culinary arts curriculum. So what happens in that particular case is students spend first 2 years learning not only chemistry, biology, a little bit of math, but they also take courses in all the culinary arts, like baking and whatever, restaurant management type of courses. So when they come into our program, they have all the culinary background that they need to be called culinologist. They have to top it off with the science that we give them at Rutgers. So they come with culinary arts background, we add science to it, and they go out as culinologists.
Got it. My producer's telling me we have 1 more minute left. I want to give our viewers a chance to see some of the props you brought and some of how the conversation, so I'm going to turn that over to you for the last minute.
Yeah, one of the research area that I have been working in last few years is called high pressure processing.
Okay.
And this is the brochure that you can keep.
Thank you.
The idea is pretty simple. You take a large container, very thick wall, fill it up with water, and put food product in it, usually in a pouch or in a flexible container, and apply a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure. Okay. Just to give you an idea, if you can imagine 3 elephants standing on a dime, what pressure that dime must feel, that much pressure you apply on water. But what that does is, it kills the bacteria in the food. It makes it safe to consume.
Oh, wow.
So without heat, because heat inherently heat it kills the bacteria, but it also causes some deteriorative reactions that you lose some flavor, you lose some nutritive value, and so on. So this is, without heat, you can make the product safer to consume. So this is a relatively new area. One of the areas that I have applied it to is clams.
Okay.
So you take clams. I don't know whether you eat raw clams.
I don't, but I understand.
But people who eat raw clams, they have some danger associated with it if they have a weak immune system.
Right.
So, but if you like to eat raw clams, then you have to make a judgment. Should I or should I not eat it? And the other issue with clams is that shucking. Many people struggle with shucking. So what we do is take this clam. This is nothing in it right now. So you imagine this clam in the high pressure. You apply a lot of pressure. The clam opens up in the chamber.
Oh, wow.
And all the bacteria in the clam are gone. So it's safe to consume. The clam detaches itself from the shell, and it just comes sliding out without the use of knife.
Oh, so you don't use a knife, so no one has to be hurt. No, it's easy to consume.
It's safer to consume. No one gets hurt, and it looks nice too. We made this presentation to many chefs, and they love the presentation. That's one of the pictures that you see on the top. So,
well, at this particular point, we're running out of time, so I don't mean to cut you off. But I want to thank you for being on the show today. It's been great to have you. I would love to have you back to talk more about what you're doing.
Thank you very much, Bill.
No problem.
Thank you.
Listen, we'll be right back.
Okay.
Welcome back. Joining me is Richard Williams, professor of sociology at Rutgers New Brunswick. Richard, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bill.
I'm glad you're here. I want to talk about your research. Your research is really looking at the social construction of identity and really focusing as it relates to racial identity and national identity. So can you talk a little bit more about what those terms mean and kind of what it's about?
Let me start by framing my
Great.
work, which tends to be a bit more, even though it's sociological, it tends to be a bit philosophical. So sometimes an audience has to bear with me a bit. But the notion of the social construction of identity is essentially a way of trying to raise the question of what do we find in nature? In other words, the idea of the social construction of identity is the opposite of the notion that ethnic and national identities are natural things that anyone finds in the world because God made them, like flowers or something like that. So the idea of the social construction is that human beings actually create these phenomena.
So if I may, can I
Sure.
potentially ask a question?
Absolutely.
So the idea of what we perceive as black in the U.S.
Right.
might not be black in Ghana or black in some place like South Africa or black's like someplace in Holland.
Right, or even, and even more broadly, the notion of black itself is something that evolved or got created at a particular historical moment for particular purposes. So the idea of blacks as a common group or whites as a common group, it looks as if they exist in nature. But in fact, my research makes the argument that those sort of beliefs are things that have been constructed rather than that we woke up as human beings and somehow said, okay, my brother because of my physical, characteristics.
So when you talk about national identities, so we're talking about the concept that might belong to somebody who's from Holland or somebody who is,
Right.
Are they similar in terms of that kind of conversation?
Absolutely, in the sense that when we think of a nation, why is a nation a nation? We may try to argue that there is a common blood, right? Common bloodline, or a common language, or a common religion. But most researchers indicate that those things aren't necessarily true. In other words, the commonality is constructed rather than that they existed in and of themselves. So it's something we do as human actors rather than that they exist in nature.
And you say that there are historical contexts to how that identity evolves.
Right, yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about how that kind of history plays or historical context plays into that?
Well, the basic question becomes, why is it necessary to have identities? What purpose, in other words, do identities play? And identities serve a purpose of cohesion. They essentially allow groups to work together to create some, to establish some goal, to create something that they desire. So how do you then convince people to commit themselves to a goal? The easiest way historically appears to be that you convince them that they all have something in common. We are working together because we are similar in some basic way. Now, take the case of blackness or Africanness, if you will. Like historically, it's clear that the people on the African continent did not perceive of themselves as African and certainly didn't conceive of themselves as black. But that notion of Africanness and blackness arose as a way to create a distinction between whiteness and blackness. But before you could create whiteness and blackness, before you could have these sort of ideas, you had to establish a mechanism by which people who were different from each other began to see themselves as similar. So how do you create an Irish identity as opposed to an English identity? And then how do you put those two together to create a white identity? How do you, in other words, the historical process of going about that, about doing that, is something that's very important for us to understand, even though we tend to not be aware of the social process itself.
So a lot of what you're also talking about is the construct of hierarchy in some ways.
Yes, or multiple hierarchies. So I like the example of Ireland or the Irish, or notion of the Irish in the U.S., for instance. From the idea of the Irish, we would presumably be able to go back in time, say to 5th century Ireland, and we would find this group of people who would call themselves Irish. But in fact, you wouldn't find that. What you would find was like a four-way split, among people who viewed themselves as different kingdoms, and they in no way perceived of themselves as, a unified group. Their Irishness arose out of a conflict with the British, and then eventually through immigration outside of Ireland itself. Right?
So in some ways, globalization and the ability to travel and interact with other folks outside of your own kingdom, outside of your own country, and outside of your own area might arise with you identifying a little differently or having a cohesiveness among a certain group.
Certainly movement, but the idea of globalization implies free movement, but these early identities were actually created through coercion. Now, there's an Irish identity was created through the coercion of the Irish famine rather than through the fact that people actually came together of their own free will.
So then is it fair to say that the conversation around blackness and Africans came around the idea of colonization?
Oh, absolutely. Right, and not only that, but the idea of the movement of peoples from Africa to the West. So it's how do you justify moving that population as opposed to some other population? Well, you can justify it by defining them as fundamentally different from the white population, and by doing so, you've got some kind of justification for it, and you are allowing the differences within the white population to perceive themselves as common relative to that singular population coming from Africa.
The other thing, too, is what strikes me is the idea of slavery. In the U.S., we have the idea of slavery as being around black folk or African folk, where the idea of slavery and the identity of slavery around the global context might include Southeast Asian, might include Indian, might include some other stuff that we wouldn't in the U.S. perceive as that based upon some of the historical context in which we see that, correct?
Right. I mean, indeed, part of my concern in my research is precisely that while we have very strong opinions about how the world works, I think ultimately as Americans our ability to think globally is very narrow, right, because of a lack of comparative understanding of how the world works.
This seems like an abstract idea, so
Right, no, it is. That's why
it's very abstract.
Right.
It's also very interesting. The question is, how do you begin to attack research or begin to approach research that seems a little bit more abstract in terms of this conversation?
Well, by and large, I like to use what I call the comparative historical method. And what the comparative historical method implies is that you're not only going to go back historically, but you're going to compare elements that we don't usually take for granted as similar to each other. So the idea of thinking about the movement of people from Ireland to the US and the creation of an Irish identity, or the movement of people from what has become Italy and then becoming Italians in the US, comparing those with the movements of people from Africa and coming and becoming black. Now, the comparative method precisely says, okay, we've tended to look at these things in isolation. Don't compare the movements of people from Africa to the movements of people from Europe. I'm saying, well, but if we don't do that, then we're going to miss something about humanity. And we're going to be very clear about slavery and what's horrific about it, but we aren't going to be as clear about what's horrific about other kinds of forced movements in the world. And so by developing a sense of commonality,
right.
I think that it's a different way of trying to transcend racial differences. You can try and transcend racial differences by saying people should love each other. They should understand
right.
the humanity of the other. But I think my research sort of argues it's not just wanting to love each other, but in fact, if we look carefully, we're going to see common histories, and that it's the common histories that have tended to be submerged, and by submerging them, we view these people as fundamentally different from each other, but in fact, they aren't fundamentally different.
So let's talk about that. So when you're talking about that, how does that fit into your new research information?
Well, now I'm following up on something or creating an idea called the problems of identity normals. And again, bear with me because of that sort of philosophical take on it. But the idea of the problem of identity normals comes out of a way of looking at traditional sociological research, which essentially says that human beings tend to become deviant or abnormal because of their inability to become socialized into normal society, right? So the kid or the group that isn't fully socialized in is abnormal. We can sort of understand that. We said, okay, but are there any problems that arise because we are actually normal, because I'm fully socialized in, right? And there, the tension is between my taking on the beliefs of the social system.
Right.
And then at some later historical moment, the social system perhaps asking me to do something which is in opposition to it. And my extreme example is that of soldiers. So as children, we're all socialized to believe thou shalt not kill. That's like a fundamental tenet of all social systems. But for some individuals, at age 18 or 20 or 25, they're asked to engage in warfare where they're actually said, your task is to kill. Now, the dichotomy between thou shalt not kill and now you should kill in the name of the society, that sort of moral breach is fascinating for me, because I think that it's an interesting model for what it means to be socialized as a child and then becoming an adult. While most of us, thank goodness, never have to actually kill someone,
Right.
all of us move from the thou shalt, that you should be a good kid, you should share your toys, you should play well with others, to being in a profession where we've got to fend for ourselves. So individualism becomes a reality for us as adults that isn't well socialized into us as children. It's the opposite. So I contend that creates, that points to a real dilemma for identity normals that are not sufficiently paid attention to. Why else do we have so many people in therapy? Why else do we have such high alcoholism or drug rates? In other words, those are real problems. Right?
This is seriously fascinating. Unfortunately, I'm being told we need to wrap. So folks can find more information on you at Rutgers.edu.
Right.
At the same time, they can find more information for us here. So at this particular point, if you're looking for more information, all you need to do is visit our website at Rutgers.tv. We want to thank you for joining us. And for all of us at the Rutgers Division of Continuing Studies, I'm Bill Leipold, and thanks for watching.